So thank you all, really everybody here, for this wonderful gathering. Because time is limited, what I thought I would do with this presentation, since we're all increasingly aware of the way in which Vajrayana came to this part of the world, through Guru Padmasambhava, who we see here pictured in his 8th manifestation as Dorje Drolo, wielding his purba, his ritual dagger, and his Vajra. And this is the enduring imprint that Guru Rinpoche, the great Mahasiddha of India, imprinted on the landscape and the psyche in Bhutan, and also on Western consciousness. So what I want to speak about in the next 14 minutes is the way in which Vajrayana entered into Western consciousness, into the Western landscape, if you will, under very different circumstances than the way Vajrayana spread throughout Asia. And basically its transformation over 150 years, which is really the time period in which Vajrayana was first introduced into the West, from a colonial era curiosity to a fully assimilated spiritual tradition that continues to productively challenge and extend the range of Western aesthetics, psychology, neuroscience, philosophy, and religion. Let's see. So in 1895, Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Austin Waddell, who was a British Army surgeon stationed in Darjeeling, he published a book with the cumbersome title, The Buddhism of Tibet, or Lamaism, with its mystic cults, symbolism, and mythology, and its relation to Indian Buddhism. So early reviews of this book described Waddell's tome as, quote unquote, one of the most complete works ever written on this topic, from metaphysics to practical magic, full explanation of the Tibetan pantheon with hundreds of charms and mantras, detailed coverage of doctrine of incarnation and reincarnation, also saints, divinity of the Dalai Lama's monastic practices, sorcery and astrology, and much more. So at the time of its first publication, Waddell's richly illustrated book was a landmark in Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhist studies. But despite its detailed descriptions of shrines, costumes, and ritual practices, Waddell's accounts were deeply colored by the prevailing Judeo-Christian mindset of his time. And bodhisattvas, for example, and mahasiddhas were referred to as saints, oracles as sorcerers, Dalai Lamas as god kings, chud practitioners as necromancers, and many important tantric deities referred to as devils and demons. So obviously we get only a slightly warped perspective. But in any case, Waddell's unapologetically colonial gaze is revealed in a critical essay published in 2000 in the journal Contributions to Nepalese Studies, entitled An Emic Critique of Austin Waddell's Buddhism and Lamaism in Tibet, a gross misrepresentation of the Vajrayana Buddhist tradition. And as this Nepalese scholar practitioner writes, Buddhism or Lamaism of Tibet by Austin Waddell cannot and should not be taken as an authoritative book of Tibetan Buddhism, but which the author calls Vajrayana. There are literally thousands of mistakes, wrong information, misinterpretations, and perhaps even deliberate distortions in his book. But this was, in fact, the way that Vajrayana was first introduced, and we see some of the pages and the cover and some of the photographs that Waddell had introduced into Western consciousness right at the turn of the 19th century. A contemporary of Waddell's, Sir Charles Bell, was posted to Darjeeling in 1900 as the imperial political officer of Sikkim, Bhutan, and Tibet. And he traveled to Lhasa in 1920 at the invitation of the 13th Dalai Lama. The Tibetan people and their culture fascinated Bell, but his writings on Tibet and Bhutan primarily emphasized history and politics. And even his 1931 book, The Religions of Tibet, focuses less on the principles and practices of Vajrayana than it does on the hierarchical structure of Tibet's monastic culture and the customs and folk beliefs of the people. But nonetheless, it was Charles Bell's photographs, Waddell's photographs before him, that had really first introduced even the word Vajrayana into Western culture. But even prior to the photographs and early writings on Tibet by colonial agents, if you will, of the British Raj, the public in Britain had learned of religious practices in the Himalayas through ethnographic displays at galleries and museums. In 1854, the first public exhibition of Tibetan artifacts at London's Crystal Palace that we see pictured here at the upper left led to an increasing interest and awareness of Tibetan art and culture among imperial collectors, as well as scholars of Asian religions in the West. And through further exhibitions at the British Museum, Tibet became increasingly known as a quote-unquote, from one of the catalogs, glamorously remote location, and curators and collectors intensified their efforts over the following decades to acquire Tibetan Buddhist art, including the paintings, sculptures, and ritual objects used in Vajrayana practice. In the United States, the first museum exhibition dedicated entirely to Tibetan art took place in 1911 at the Newark Museum of Art, which is not far from New York City. And the exhibition contextualized 150 objects that had been collected by medical missionaries, Dr. and Mrs. Albert Shelton, in eastern Tibet. Today, the Newark Museum of Art is the largest collection and most important repository of Tibetan art in the Americas. And the museum has structured its displays around a central altar that you see here that was consecrated by the Dalai Lama. And its monastically inspired galleries have been given names such as the Chapel of the Masters, Chapel of Fierce Protectors, Pure Lands and Paradises, and there's also an additional Tibet information zone that provides interactive educational resources for the museum visitors. And it's only in more recent years, at exhibitions such as those at the Rubin Museum of Himalayan Art in New York City, that attention has been given to Vajrayana Buddhism's larger history outside of Tibet, and greater efforts made to contextualize Vajrayana through immersive and experiential installations. And we see here a permanent exhibition at the Rubin Museum, basically creating a virtual Tibetan shrine room, and then the interactive displays that are put on periodically at the museum. So one of the hallmarks of exhibitions of Tibetan art or Tantric Buddhist art in the West have been what you see here, which is red-robed monks creating intricate sand mandalas. It's become standard features since 1991 with the Wisdom and Compassion Sacred Art of Tibet exhibition in New York and San Francisco. But this idea of the mandala was actually really the way in which the West first really became aware of the principles within Vajrayana Buddhism. And these occurred during the 1920s through the work of the Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung, who recognized in mandalas as a means of accessing the subconscious and transpersonal depths of the human mind. And just as mandalas serve an interactive and initiatory function, of course, within traditional Vajrayana context, they became increasingly a way in which Vajrayana was introduced to the West through a familiar aesthetic. At the same time that Jung was doing his work on mandalas and actually creating his own mandalas and having his patients create mandalas as what he referred to them as archetypes of wholeness, Alexandre David Neal, who was a great adventurer and explorer from France. I'm just concerned about time. Can you just let me know how much time I have, just so I pace this?
You're doing fine. You've still got
good. Okay.
eight minutes.
Good, okay. And she studied Tummo and other esoteric practices with Vajrayana masters in Sikkim and Tibet in the 1920s, and published more than 30 popular books, including Magic and Mystery in Tibet, and what we see here, The Secret Oral Teachings in Tibetan Buddhist Sects. Interestingly, in one of her memorable passages in one of her books, she'd asked her teacher, why are these teachings secret? Because she was writing a lot about what we heard about earlier today, these inner Vajrayana practices working with the subtle body of the winds and the channels. And as her teacher replied, these teachings are not called secret because it's forbidden to talk about them. They are secret because so few who hear about them understand what they mean. So this sort of contextualizes a bit about even what we mean by, in a context like this, talking about practices that have traditionally been kept secret. But this is an early quotation of different ways of understanding the nuances of that word. Following the success of Alexander Davanil's spiritual travelogues and narratives, the American anthropologist Walter Evans Wentz authored 4 seminal works on Vajrayana Buddhism for Oxford University Press, including a 1927 translation of the Bardo Todel, which was translated as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and which Carl Jung wrote the introduction for. And again, this was a way in which, with Carl Jung's, you could say, endorsement, was a way in which Vajrayana concepts became increasingly acceptable to the Western mind. A further book by Evans Wentz was published in 1935 based on translations of treatises on the 6 yogas of Naropa. And this book was entitled Tibetan Yoga and Secret Doctrines, which we see here. The work of transmitting Tibet's innermost tantric teachings to the West continued with an American named Theos Bernard, who traveled to Tibet in 1936, referring to himself as a white lama. This is quite distinct from some of the early sort of travelers to Tibet who were often very dismissive of the culture. Bernard was very deeply committed to the practice, not only of Tibetan Buddhism, but also very much of Hatha Yoga, which he'd been studying in India prior to his going to Tibet in 1936. And when he came back to the States in 1939, he established something called the American Institute of Yoga, through which he hoped to propagate Tibetan Buddhist teachings in the West. So at this point, it wasn't his idea of the American Institute of Yoga was not Hatha Yoga as we would understand it today, but very much involved the more complex and comprehensive practices involved in, okay. I'll do a little fast. There's a lot to say there with him, but I'll skip that. Sorry, how many minutes was that?
5.
5, good, okay. So I'm going to skip that, and we'll go to... Anyway, very fascinating. He brought back some of the first texts on Tsalung Trulkor from Tibet in 1939, published several books, one called The Penthouse of the Gods. But what his work was actually remarkable for was his trying to bring back the embodied physical practices of Tsalung Trulkor and Hatha Yoga into the Vajrayana Buddhist tradition, and that was his vision in 1939 of a kind of particular form of Vajrayana Buddhism appropriate for the West. But unfortunately, he died prematurely in 1947 in a riot in Delhi, although the book, The White Lama, that describes his life claims that it happened up in Lahore Spiti. But so his work of essentially transmitting Vajrayana Buddhism to the West was continued by a German-born man known as Lama Anagarika Govinda, and one of his most remarkable books, which was published in 1960, is The Foundations of Tibetan Mysticism. And this really represented a new era of scholarship in the West, based upon his own very, very extensive studies from 1930, when he was first introduced to Vajrayana Buddhism in Darjeeling. I'm going to skip a lot because of time, but Lama Govinda is quite interesting because he founded in 1967 what he claimed to be the first international Vajrayana order, which he called the Arya Maitreya Mandala. And he described it as a quote-unquote organized unity of individuals grouped around and directed towards a common center represented by the ideal and active path of the Vajrayana as the integration and culmination of all previous schools of Tibetan Buddhism. In 1959, Tibet was absorbed, of course, by Communist China, and the threat to Vajrayana Buddhism led to an increasing efforts to preserve Tibetan culture. Briefly, one of the most effective initiatives during this period was done by a British-born woman named Frida Bedi, later known as Sister Palmo. She was the first ordained Western woman in Vajrayana, ordained by the 16th Karmapa in 1966. But what she is perhaps most notable for is in 1960, she founded what was called the Young Tulku School, or the School for Young Lamas, in Dalhousie, India, under which many Western lamas who became very influential in the West received their first education in English. This included Akun Tulku, Tarthang Tulku, Chogyam Trungpa, as well as many others, all of whom learned very good English and allowed them to continue their teachings and practices into the West. Of course, Chogyam Trungpa was extraordinarily influential in the 1970s and 60s in the United States and in Europe. In his often very idiosyncratic but effective ways of translating Vajrayana concepts into an American idiom, a Western idiom at that time. So you'll see on the internet, for example, there are many quotes from Trungpa, such as this one here, which are sort of bringing this idea of relative and absolute truth into kind of everyday terms, often very effectively. So briefly, skipping ahead, we get to the medicalization of Vajrayana in the West. So as I was going to say, one thing about Trungpa that was actually very important is in 1974, he founded Naropa University in Boulder, Colorado. And it was really the first study center university ever founded very specifically on Vajrayana Buddhist principles. And of course, this name dedicated to Naropa, the great Mahasiddha from India. So this is something, again, that comes up in our minds now, and it's been this idea of creating an international institute of Vajrayana studies in Bhutan. We can look back at some of these early initiatives from many decades ago. But the sort of concluding things I want to say are about the introduction, sort of the impact, you could say, of Vajrayana Buddhist studies in the academic world, the University of Naropa, and the increasing interest in researching the actual effects of Vajrayana Buddhist practices. And we're going to be hearing a lot about that, of course, during the next few days. But this is involved, as we see here, implanting practitioners with electrodes and subjecting them to MRI machines. Some of the earliest work on this was in 1982 by Dr. Herbert Benson at Harvard University, who, with the Dalai Lama's direct approval, studied the effects of Tummo, or the yogas of inner heat, on several different Tibetan practitioners. Okay. So I'm going to follow up. I'm going to skip a lot of this because I have been asked, at the request of Dzongtsar Khyentse Rinpoche, who I met again in London just a week or so ago, to just say a few remarks, because I'm sure everyone's here aware that Vajrayana in the Western world is going through a major sort of transition right now because of some of issues that have arisen. But he's asked me just to make a few points that kind of summarize some of the things that he said over the course of several long presentations he's made at Western Dharma centers, particularly the Rigpa Fellowship. So in that regard, I can take 2 more minutes, if that's all right. He has mentioned that, I'm just going to read this. This is with his approval. He emphasized Vajrayana's relevance in the modern world because of its emphasis on critical inquiry, its commitment to questioning the nature of experience and clearly distinguishing between apparent phenomena and the empty, luminous ground from which appearances arise. And it's in this regard that even what science assumes to be empirical, quote-unquote, facts should be recognized as provisional paradigms that, like all other mental phenomena, are subject to change. Dzongtsar Khyentse also sought on his teaching tour to disabuse Western Vajrayana students of what he referred to as often outmoded and archaic aspects of Tibetan culture that contemporary students in the West have sometimes mistaken for inherent principles of Vajrayana. He emphasized the importance of distinguishing between provisional and ultimate meaning in the Vajrayana teachings, and of returning to root texts such as the Vajracchedika and the Vajratantra to determine whether or not one actually feels suited for the Vajrayana path, as other forms of Buddhist practice may be less physically, emotionally, or intellectually demanding. In regard to Samaya, which was a major issue that came up during the course of his teachings, he said that the 9th century Mahasiddha Tilopa, from whom the entire Kagyu lineage of whispered precepts derives, stated it very clearly in his Mahamudropadesha, the Song of Mahamudra, as Tilopa proclaimed, "The real vow of Samaya is broken by thinking in terms of precepts, and it is maintained with the cessation of fixed ideas. Let thoughts rise and subside like ocean waves. If you neither dwell, perceive, nor stray from the ultimate, the tantric precepts are automatically upheld like a lamp which illuminates darkness." Lastly, it was clear to Dzongso Khyentse Rinpoche that whereas the monastic form of Vajrayana will continue to flourish in the Himalayan regions, the West is more existentially suited to the teachings of the Mahasiddhas. And although, of course, many of the Mahasiddhas were trained deeply and extensively in monastic environments, they ultimately espoused a path of enlightened engagement whereby the flow of empty, lucid awareness could be integrated within all spheres of human experience. That state of Mahamudra, or existential union of samsara and nirvana, is Vajrayana's distinguishing characteristic. And as Khyentse Rinpoche made clear, it is not necessarily a path for everyone. In 1985, when Vajrayana was taking firm root in America, Chögyam Trungpa offered the same advisory to his Western students. As Trungpa said, "This warning has been given hundreds of times. Don't get into Tantra just like that. It's dangerous. Every Tantric text begins with that warning. Be careful, think twice. Don't take this carelessly." But interestingly, the more you put students off, the more interested they become. So there's some more that Rinpoche shared, but I think I'll stop there just given the issues of time, but I'm happy. This will all be written up, and as I said, I was asked to make those final comments. So thank you for your time and patience.